Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Bharti Kansara, Vice President of American Friends of SOAS, and I am delighted to introduce you all to our main speaker in the 8th American Friends of SOAS webinar since the pandemic began. Ashley Crawford is our main speaker, and she's an alumna of both Oxford University and SOAS, where she is currently embarking on an MA in the history of art. Ashley is speaking on a topic very dear to her heart, that of increasing accessibility for disabled visitors in museums. She is herself both an excellent scholar of art and music, as well as an ambulatory wheelchair user. She has long navigated museums using mobility devices and witnessed firsthand many much needed areas for improving the museum experience for disabled visitors, which she will share with us today. Ashley will give us a 30-minute presentation with slides on how to avoid common flaws in curatorial design and writing so as to more closely achieve the goals of disability rights legislation and to integrate through universal design protocols wheelchair accessible construction into the overall architectural structure of museums. It is such a pleasure for me to introduce you to this talented and determined young woman with a long history of advocating for disability rights. She has previously researched barriers to classical music education for blind students while at Oxford. She has served as the Vice President of the Claremont College's Disability Alliance and taught a wheelchair accessible ballroom dance curriculum, both in California and England. She has also danced herself as a member of the Candoco Dance Company's youth group in London, which specializes in contemporary integrated dance for both disabled and non-disabled dancers. In conversation with Ashley will be our moderator for today, SOAS's very own Dr. Maria Costoglou, who is a lecturer in curating and museology. Maria has special expertise in ancient metalwork and has previously worked with museums in Britain and abroad. From 2018 to 2020, Maria also co-directed SOAS's MA in Museums, Heritage and Material Culture Studies, using the remarkable SOAS collections, which are not only books, but also amazing artifacts. Maria is organizing a museum studies summer school at SOAS, which now is likely to take place in 2022. As you listen to Ashley's presentation, please enter any questions that come to mind into the chat box, and Maria will select and read them out. And there will be a vote of thanks at the end given by our wonderful president of American Friends of SOAS, Greg Bowie. Please welcome both Ashley Crawford and Maria Costoglou.
All right, I'll be sharing my screen now. Let's see.
Thank you for the introductions, Bharti.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes.
There we
You
go.
can go to presentation mode.
Yes.
Cool.
There we go. Everyone can see that, yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. My name's Ashley, and today we're going to discuss accessibility and inclusivity in museums, covering common issues that disabled patrons encounter and potential solutions that both institutions and individuals can incorporate to make the museum-going experience better for everyone. A little bit about me. I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, which is a term that means I use a wheelchair and can also walk. At any given time when I visit a museum, depending on the day, I might be using a wheelchair, a crutch, or no mobility aid at all. Let's see. Oh gosh, there we go. So this is a picture of me at a monk exhibition at SF MoMA, one of my favorite museums, using a wheelchair. Oh, and just a little bit about image descriptions. They are good common practice to make PowerPoints accessible, so I'll be using them in mine. And on to part one, what is disability? Before I talk about museums, first, it's worth taking a few moments to review what we actually mean by the term disability. The US and the UK both have similar disability legislation, but for the sake of continuity, I'm going to focus on the US, looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, because its definition set the standard for public museums, for public settings and museums. First, it's worth noting that the ADA is the most significant piece of disability rights legislation passed in American history. While there were some laws passed before it, the ADA is a comprehensive piece of legislation that has set the standard for equal access to a wide range of spheres, including, but not limited to, education, the workplace, and public buildings. So, in the US, the ADA defines an individual with a disability as anyone who meets at least one of the following criteria. One, a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Two, a person who has a history or record of such impairment. Or three, a person who's perceived by others as having such an impairment. Parts 2 and 3 of the definition are very similar to part 1, in that the individual can also have a history of impairment or be perceived by others to have it. In most instances, the focus is still on part 1 of the definition. Generally, a condition is categorized as a disability if it's long-standing, meaning a duration of at least 6 months, although in practice, disabilities can often last longer. So, what are the main takeaways from this definition? The line substantially limits one or more major life activities is the most important part, with major life activities meaning common or essential tasks that non-disabled peers engage in. One example of this is walking. If someone has a mobility disability, getting around would be considered a major life activity. If a disabled individual can't complete an activity or needs assistance to do it, it requires a reasonable accommodation in public settings. Depending on the budget involved to implement the accommodation and the size of the business, sometimes what the ADA considers reasonable is up to the discretion and interpretation of the business, which can result in some businesses being more accessible than others. Which leads us to the question, why talk about disability? 20% of the world's population has at least one disability, or 1 out of every 5 people. It's suspected that in museums, the percentage of disabled museum goers is much higher, given that museums attract a larger number of senior citizens who might have disabilities. The term disability encompasses a wide range of conditions, resulting in confusion for many as what counts as disability and who's allowed to claim the term disabled. Because the definition of disability is so encompassing, many people do actually count, so to speak, as being disabled without even realizing that this is a label that they can adopt. Other times, some who fall under the umbrella of disability may choose not to identify as disabled due to stigma, whether internalized or imposed externally. Disability in museums. In addition to the 20% of the population that's disabled, about 25% of Europeans have at least one family member who's also disabled. Museums are a very family-friendly activity, so if a family wants to visit a museum and it's not accessible to someone within their family, they're either going to go anyway and have a negative experience or decide to go elsewhere. Both scenarios hurt museums. So how do museums prevent this? And what can accommodations look like in museums? For example, if a patron has difficulty walking, museums can provide alternatives, including, but not limited to, chairs, wheelchairs, ramps, or lifts. But this is a very bare minimum. There's a lot more that they can do. I've used mobility impairments as an example here, but this is only one of many types of disabilities that museums must take into consideration. Only about 6 to 8% of the disabled population uses a wheelchair, meaning that the overwhelming majority of disabilities are invisible. So what does that mean? An invisible disability means that the impairment is not obvious to bystanders. Some disabilities are more visible than others, and some also fluctuate between being visible and invisible. For example, as an ambulatory wheelchair user, my disability is much more visible when I'm using a wheelchair than when I'm not using any devices. Using a wheelchair on certain days doesn't make me any more disabled, and using no devices on other days doesn't make me any less so. The idea that a disability must be visible to be proven legitimate to non-disabled people is a harmful one, not to mention completely inaccurate. The disability rights movement has long been fighting this stereotype, and its erasure is essential to respecting people's invisible disabilities. Part 2 is a crash course for disability theory. So, what is ableism? Ableism is at the heart of why we're doing this webinar today. Unless you're disabled yourself or have learned something about the disability rights movement, it's very well possible that you haven't ever come across the word ableism before. So what is it? In its simplest definition, ableism is disability-based discrimination. This means that ableism is a form of identity-based discrimination too. Unpacking this a bit further, it's discrimination by non-disabled people against disabled people, with the belief that not being disabled is inherently superior and that disabled people need to be fixed in order to be considered equal. Ableism comes in many shapes and forms. So in order to cover them all today, this webinar would have had to have been several hours longer. So instead, I'm going to highlight the types that disabled visitors are most likely to encounter in museum visits, especially wheelchair users. Types of ableism can generally be categorized into 2 forms. The first is institutional ableism. This means discrimination that's caused by structural and/or legal factors. It can stem from loopholes in government legislation that don't protect disabled individuals as a group. Laws such as the ADA and the Equality Act, which is the British equivalent, prevent a lot of institutional ableism from happening, but they're not foolproof and there's still a long way to go. Institutional ableism is at play at museums. This can manifest in a number of ways, such as not complying with legislation and offering reasonable adjustments, not displaying work by disabled artists. As a hint, Van Gogh and Frida Kahlo were not the only disabled artists ever to have lived. Museums definitely need to find more disabled artists to put on display. Another example is having untrained staff regarding basic accessibility information. Not training your staff to know the answers to basic questions at the museum. If they have to ask a lot of other employees who also don't know, it's sending disabled patrons the message that our accessing the museum is not a priority to the institution. Another one is telling ableist narratives in curatorial writing. This is one of the biggest ones. Another is not having proper accessibility info on your website or having insufficient information. If I, as a wheelchair user, have to spend more than about 15 seconds looking on your website for accessibility information, and especially if I have to email or call somebody to find out, then the website is not accessible enough, even if it technically complies. Some more of them are requiring separate entrances for certain disabled visitors or not allowing them at all. Yes, that actually can happen. Requiring disabled visitors to take the freight lift when there's no visitor lift available or it's broken. Wheelchair users are not cargo or even works of art. We just want to be treated like other visitors. Also, requiring wheelchair users to be accompanied by staff on lifts is a bit infantilizing. These museums believe that they're being accessible by providing a lift at all, but when a wheelchair user has to disrupt the flow of the visit and depend on a staff member to do what a walking visitor can do without one, that's ableism. The second type of ableism is everyday ableism, a category that's very, very wide. It can range from larger popular culture to face-to-face microaggressions. In museums, some example of these can include not providing enough or any accessible toilets, or having them being located far away from everything else in the museum, having staff use ableist language, which we'll briefly talk about later, holding events that aren't accessible or not providing accessibility information when advertising those events, asking visitors what their disabilities are. This is a big one. Museum professionals are not medical doctors, so this is highly inappropriate and not the place to have these conversations. If a visitor really finds it essential for the staff to know what their disability is, they'll definitely tell them themselves. So this is a very important part of disability here. Or disability theory. This is the first model of disability. It's probably the most common one, the most well-known one, even if people don't know what it's called. So the first is the medical model of disability. Under the medical model, disability is a medical impairment that's a problem and needs solving through something such as medical treatment. The only solutions come through fixing the impairment itself. It's more individual focused and not at all society focused. For example, if a wheelchair user can't enter a building, it's because something's wrong with their body and they can't climb the stairs, not because there isn't a ramp or a lift. Notice that the definitions of disability in the ADA that I previously provided define disability in terms of the medical model, talking about impairments. This reveals that the medical model is so ingrained in our discourse of disability that it's difficult even to just define disability without including some of these medical terms. In recent years, some disability rights activists have created alternate definitions of disability that steer away from the medical model. These definitions are continuously evolving and are absolutely worthy of discussion, as well as further academic study. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're only going to look at the medical and social models. The next one is the social model. Under this model, a medical impairment is not inherently an issue to be fixed. The problem is not the disabled person. Instead of being individually focused, it's society focused. This means if a wheelchair user can't enter a building, that's the fault of the people in charge of the building, not of the wheelchair user. Solutions are things like ramps and lifts, not medical treatment or fixing the disabled person. The social model also defines disability differently. Under this model, disability focuses on what a person is inherently capable of doing before considering external factors. So what does that mean? A person is inherently abled until external factors such as inaccessibility disable them. When institutions are accessible and offer accommodations such as ramps and lifts, the disabled person is then enabled to access the same rights as others. One thing I'd like to touch on briefly is the verbiage for the terms people with disabilities or disabled people. This is very, very contested sometimes. So some people prefer the term people with disabilities, or what's also called person-first language, because it demonstrates that people are more than their disabilities, and above all else, they're human beings just like everyone else. But in most disability rights circles, the activist circles, the preferred term is disabled, or what's called identity-first language. Why? The answer is very simple. Under the social model, disability is neither a bad thing nor a bad word. For example, I wouldn't call myself a person with womanness, I call myself a woman. Other forms of marginalization except disability consistently use identity-first language, and disability appears to be the only form of marginalization where a lot of people try to remove the marginalized identity from the person. This can happen with both abled and able and disabled people. So it's very, very common. It's not just non-disabled people who are doing this. So in disability rights circles, to use person-first language reveals good intentions, definitely, but it's implying that disability is an inherently negative quality and something to be ashamed of, which under the social model, it's not. To summarize, proponents of person-first language or people with disabilities wish to show that they're more than their disability, which is completely valid, while users of identity-first language acknowledge that their experiences with disability have shaped their lives and are ultimately inseparable from their identity, even if disability doesn't make up their whole identity. This can be a very touchy subject, and people have very strong views about it. So if you don't know which term to use with someone, please just ask. Always respect someone's personal preferences first. So on to part 3, disability and universal design, a market for improvement. For visitors with mobility impairments, inaccessible museums can present a maze of physical obstacles, the first and most obvious of which is simply entering and exiting the building. As the disability rights movement grew in California in the 1970s, 2 decades before the ADA, architects were already brainstorming how to get more visitors with mobility impairments inside public buildings. This was partially because in the several decades following the World Wars, America suddenly had a much larger group of disabled veterans than before, who now needed to participate in society again. This created a much higher demand for the invention of new adaptive tools for everyday use, as well as public architecture that veterans could easily access. So for early universal design, many architects and designers were eager to take on this new challenge, discussing and practicing and implementing a new concept called universal design, which meant design that was intended for use both by disabled and non-disabled customers. The term was coined by architect Ron Mace, a wheelchair user who had polio as a child. Universal design means that the item is constructed for everyone, not solely for any one group. However, at the time, disability was even more stigmatized than it is now, so marketing schemes downplayed disability when it was even mentioned at all. This could have been for a few reasons. One is that marketers might not have wanted to draw attention to something our society associated with such negativity. People with impairments who didn't like thinking of themselves as disabled might have shied away from products that were specifically advertised for disabled people. Or non-disabled people might have mistakenly believed that a disabled-oriented product might not have served them as well as a so-called normal one. The obvious downside to all of this was that disabled users needed to rely on word of mouth to actually know what certain products or places were accessible to them, since there was rarely clarity in the marketing. Instead, merchandise was simply described as usable for everyone. For the first time, architects as well as designers of household items began taking disability into consideration when designing their products, especially as companies realized that the more disabled customers their products targeted, the wider their profit margins could become. So here's a really great example of this. A product of universal design that has affected nearly every Western household over the last 30 years is Tupperware. So in the early 90s, Tupperware, the company, hired Morrison Cousins, a designer whose mother struggled to open the original design of the containers. Keeping her in mind, he reformed the design to include a tab on the top that made the containers much easier to open because it was quite large, regardless of one's own dexterity. Tupperware is still as popular as ever today, and the brand success soared after they amended the design. Although Tupperware wasn't and isn't specifically marketed as disabled friendly, and there's still some people who can't use it, this update demonstrated how implementing universal design served both disabled customers as well as just increasing usability for everyone. Simply put, and I'm definitely far from the first one to say this, universal design is just good design. It's really important to emphasize this idea too, because it hasn't always been the main school of thought. Before the ADA, it was very commonly believed amongst architects and museum curators alike that increasing one type of accessibility would detract from other non-disabled visitors' experiences. User surveys have overwhelmingly shown that this just simply isn't the case. While this webinar is not about Tupperware or household items, the same principles of universal design do still apply. We're now going to look at an architectural example of universal design. Let's see. There we go. So this building is probably recognizable to a lot of you. It is the Victoria and Albert Museum in South Kensington. So what we're looking at here is the Cromwell Road entrance, which is the main entrance, the front entrance. And this is my favorite example of universal design in a museum, especially for entrances, because it so seamlessly integrates the ramp into the overall design of the staircase. It's true that a completely flat entrance would have been the most ideal setup for a wheelchair user, but given the height of where the actual entrance to the building is, this isn't always possible. This design is a great solution because the ramp here creates a very gentle slope over a longer distance, which improves the wheelchair user's overall experience because steep slopes can often be very difficult for some wheelchair users, mostly manual wheelchair users like me. So notice that there's no separate entrance for wheelchair users. They can use the main one just like everyone else. One of the benefits of this is that wheelchair users still get to see the same grandeur of the immediate interior space. If you've ever been in it, it has high ceilings. It's just gorgeous. With the welcoming area and the information desks and the ticketing, which is something that doesn't happen at many other museums where wheelchair users are forced to take the side or back entrance. Another benefit is that they don't get separated from their friends when they enter the building. Everyone can enter together. There's no sense of othering. And most importantly, it gives wheelchair users dignity and shows that the institution is our ally, which is very important. This example of universal design achieves both accessibility and aesthetics by not having to compromise on either. If an institution really wants to prioritize accessibility, it can be done. It's worth mentioning that the V&A redid this entrance in 2001, even though it's a grade 1 building. Using old historic buildings is no longer a sufficient excuse for excluding disabled visitors. If the V&A could do this 20 years ago, other museums can definitely do it today. So now we're going to talk about curatorial design a bit. So universal design meets curatorial design. So we'll be looking at how universal design in museums is more than just architecture. Once a museum has actually managed to get its visitors inside, the focus shifts to the exhibitions. And this is when universal design must also apply to the curation. So we're going to look at an example, which was from the Boston Museum of Science, and they showed how increasing accessibility affected visitor satisfaction in one particular exhibition. So in the mid-1980s, the museum had a disabled volunteer who alerted the staff to inaccessibility in some of their exhibitions, making suggestions. So they used a specific exhibition to look at this. It was called the New England Habitats Diorama. And so they used this for the study, and they surveyed visitors about their satisfaction and interest in the area before any changes were made. And the curators noticed that because this space mostly consisted of written information and glass display panels, the area was completely inaccessible to blind patrons. And remember, this was still several years before the ADA was implemented. So there was a lot less information around, and largely before the internet too. So people just did not know as much about accessibility then. So the curators then added several sections to the exhibit, such as a tactile section, an audio track of nature sounds, and a smelling station. After adding these sections, the museum surveyed both disabled and non-disabled visitors and found that both groups rated the exhibition much more positively than before the new sections had been added. After they did this, the exhibition became a much more social space. Visitors stayed longer in the area, discussed the material with each other more, and just overall learned a lot more and retained a lot more. In this instance, making an exhibition more accessible to a certain group of disabled visitors enhanced its quality for all visitors. So on the next slide, this is just what the area looked like before. And they added some new stuff where you could touch things and listen and smell. But if you look at the before picture, it's just all visual information. So really, really inaccessible to a certain group of people. So they made a video about this a few years ago, and they made a lot of suggestions about how to make museums more accessible. They advised fellow museums to enhance their accessibility by mostly by working more with disabled people in capacities such as hiring them, engaging them as volunteers, which is actually what led to the improvement of that one exhibition, forming an advisory council of members with different types of disabilities, and using disabled visitors as a prototype audience for new exhibitions. So all of these suggestions are really great. They're very helpful, and they make it more accessible for everyone. But I also think that every museum must take a step further that's not discussed nearly enough in nonprofit circles, which is disabled people need to be integrated better into any museum's board of directors and senior level management for a number of reasons, which include a very obvious one that should go without saying. It's ethical. Representation matters. The diversity of any institution's leadership should reflect the diversity of its visitors in order to best meet the needs and interests of each demographic. Representation at senior levels can help prevent institutional ableism for visitors before it even happens. And when ableism, whether systematic or cultural, does occur, if there's someone who actually has a disability who's in a position to help, then they can do so more efficiently. It's worth noting that this type of representation that I'm talking about is different from simply having a disability and inclusion officer in an administrative role, which is also a great thing to have, great and necessary. This position is very helpful, but often the people in these positions don't always have a disability themselves. So the more people and the more disabled people in roles you can get, the better. So implementing as many of these practices as possible can help museums avoid very preventable curatorial problems that exclude disabled visitors from feeling like they're truly welcome at the museum. And so a question that maybe you're asking after learning a bit about universal design is there really such thing as completely universal design? In some cases, yes, but in a lot of cases, no, not entirely. Some examples, and again, this is mobility. A lot of these examples are mobility focused because I'm a wheelchair user, and just for continuity. But some examples include museums with ramps, even ones that are up to code might be too steep for some manual wheelchair users. Or with the Boston Museum of Science example, some written or other descriptions for people with sensory disabilities might not provide the exact same experience as the original objects in certain exhibitions. So what does universal design actually mean then? I think in practice, it means presenting visitors with options when the museum cannot be 100% accessible 100% of the time. An example of this is what we saw with the Boston Museum of Science. Even though not every single disabled visitor was able to experience every single aspect of the specific exhibition, the curators offered many sensory alternatives so that each visitor could take part in at least one aspect of the exhibition, leaving no one out entirely. In short, universal design in practice, especially curatorial practice, can mean ample options. This might not follow the traditional definition of universal design, but it achieves a similar goal of engaging all visitors, especially without naturally drawing attention to differences in ability. As a side note, other disability rights activists have more recently taken issue with the term universal design, claiming a better route would be to embrace individual disabled identity instead of attempting a universal solution, when universal design won't deliver the exact same experience for everyone. That said, though, even if true universal design can't be achieved in all contexts, it's still an inclusive standard that designers and curators should aim for as much as possible. And now, the last part and my favorite part is a visitor's guide. So this is etiquette for visitors. It's probably my favorite part because it's the most relevant to the entire audience. Everyone watching this webinar right now is able to participate in proper museum etiquette, regardless of whether or not you're affiliated with a museum. So now we know a bit about disability theory basics and measures that museums can take to prevent institutional ableism. However, the museum itself is only a fraction of any disabled visitor's experience at an in-person exhibition, and positive or negative interactions with other visitors can have a big impact on how the visit goes. Now I'm going to talk a bit about how fellow visitors can either enhance or detract from disabled patrons' experiences. I'm going to be speaking from my experiences as a wheelchair user, so these will mainly be mobility focused, but some of them are more universal too. So here is some behavior for non-disabled visitors to avoid. Firstly, if you see a wheelchair user, do not touch their chair without their permission or any mobility equipment. Many times people think they're helping, for example, on a lift, and they just stand behind the wheelchair user and start pushing them out. This is extremely startling and distressing. For example, that's happened to me many, many times. And sometimes I don't actually want to leave the lift. I'm not on the correct floor. It's not time for me to leave the lift yet. So please don't do it, especially without asking. On a similar note, if a wheelchair user is looking at an object in an exhibition and you would like your turn to look at it to arrive faster, please do not push the wheelchair user out of your way. It's the same principle. Also, don't ask if you can try out our medical equipment. It's usually very expensive and specialized, and it also sends the message that you'd like to try on our disability, which can come off as a bit like downplaying everything else that comes with a disabled identity. Please don't ask us what happened, or jokingly with a disapproving look, say, "What'd you do to yourself?" This happens to me a lot as a young person in a wheelchair. Really, I've said it before, and I'll definitely say it again. Wheelchair users are just there to enjoy the art or whatever it is on display, just like everybody else. I will say, though, that one exception is children. I'm always very happy to talk to kids who come up to me and ask questions, and their curiosity is a really great opportunity to destigmatize disability and prevent them from forming ableist assumptions from a young age. If you have children and they'd like to ask something, as long as you teach them to do so politely, it can be a good thing. And I think a lot of other wheelchair users feel this way too, but not always. There are definitely some people who don't like that. Another one is if you're at an exhibition that's overcrowded and you're in a group of standing visitors who are blocking the view of a wheelchair user and not moving, please ask the wheelchair user if they need you to move or if they would like to come closer. It's very emotionally draining as a wheelchair user to have to constantly shout politely, "Excuse me," in a loud, crowded room full of people who will not move. It gets very old very fast. If you see a wheelchair user coming your way and you're blocking their path, please preemptively move much farther than you think you need to. But please do so politely, not like we're about to run you over. Most wheelchair users have been using our devices for years, and we know what we're doing. We don't bite, I promise. Please be mindful of other disabled visitors' intersectionalities. Their disabled identity is important, but it's not their only identity. Being disability inclusive never excuses microaggressions for any other type of discriminatory behavior. And part 2. If a wheelchair user is accompanied by a carer, And especially if they're accompanied by family or friends and you have something to say to the wheelchair user, please address the wheelchair user directly, not the person the wheelchair user is with. Wheelchair users have a wide range of disabilities, and non-disabled people far too often just assume that wheelchair users are either nonverbal or have intellectual disabilities. That can be true, but the overwhelming majority of wheelchair users are able to talk to you. Please address the wheelchair user directly. And adding to that, please talk to wheelchair users normally. This means no baby voices, extra slow talk, or pitying tones. Because we know how you're talking to us, and we just want to be talked to like adults. And I can't believe that I have to say this one too, but if you're a stranger, please don't take photos of wheelchair users or any other disabled visitors that you see, especially without our permission. But better yet, please just don't do it at all. This actually did happen to me once when I was at a museum in Frankfurt. I was with a friend and a tourist asked me what I was doing out of the house and then just started taking photos of me for his social media to show his friends and followers that I was inspirational for leaving the house, just for showing up at the museum. And things like that, you know, we notice when people take photos of us. It's very humiliating, especially when it's done without consent. Yeah, sometimes people try to hide that, but it's usually quite obvious. And speaking of inspiration, it's not very up to date to call people with any kind of disability inspirational. It's meant to be a compliment, but it has a very problematic history. And if you'd like to learn more about why, there are two disability rights activists in particular, Stella Young and Haben Girma, who have spoken extensively on this. And they have videos on YouTube and articles and lots of things you can read if you're interested in that. And lastly, know that calling us disabled and using the word, especially using the word disability, really is okay. Here's some terms to avoid. And if you have any questions after the presentation about why, please do ask. I'd be very happy to discuss them. Some of them include differently abled, handicapped, crippled. That's definitely the worst one. Please don't say that. Suffers from, when talking about diagnoses and inspiring. And last but not least, wheelchair bound. This is often meant with very good intentions, but it's not accurate because full-time wheelchair users are never wheelchair bound. They do plenty of things that aren't in their chairs. So instead of wheelchair bound, a full-time wheelchair user is the preferred term. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Ashley, for a very eloquent and provoking presentation, and for sharing your personal experiences and your research with us all. There are a few questions which I would like to ask you, and there are a couple in the audience. So I think, let me tidy up a little bit my Q&A and chat boxes before I come to you. Excellent. I would like to start with the language used to by museums, by visitors, by everyone, and you have mentioned a couple of terms that we shouldn't be mentioning. And can you elaborate on that? And also on this point, there is a question from the audience by Sunny, who asks that Sunny says she heard the term differently abled.
Yes.
Do you feel that this is less ableist? So yes, if you elaborate on the terms that are more respectful, and answer Sunny's comment. Thank you.
That's a great question. So differently abled is not a perfect term to use, but it's definitely a well-intentioned one. So definitely some points for that. Some people are fine with it, but what the word differently abled is, what the term is, is really just a euphemism for disability. And part of what with the social model that we're trying to get at is that the word disability really is okay, and any word that tries to kind of dance around disability is not up to date. It's just saying disability or disabled. And the reason for differently abled specifically, where it came from was that people wanted to show that that disabled people do have abilities. They have, and in a lot of instances, we have resilience and different strengths. So, humans are very resilient and adaptable in general. When something like a disability happens to us, we're able to adapt in a lot of ways, emotionally, physically, etc. So that's where that term came from. People wanted to emphasize that our abilities are different because we've learned to adapt in those ways. But so it was a very good intention, and it raised a very good point. But the problem with it is that people started saying it because they didn't want to say disability. And a reason that, especially in educational systems, you hear special needs and you hear differently abled a lot. And the needs aren't special. The needs are basic access needs, getting to school, getting the correct education at school, getting access to buildings. So it's true that disabled people can develop resilience, but that doesn't mean that we're differently abled. Using that term shifts the focus away from the social model, which is that society disables us. That's a great question. Thank you for that.
And following on from that, would you like to share some other examples from your own personal experiences that of everyday ableism? I think sometimes these things might happen unconsciously. And yes. Would you elaborate on how you experience that in everyday situations?
Yeah, I've a lot of the examples I gave, I've definitely experienced myself. For example, people touching my wheelchair. A lot of it definitely is what's considered casual ableism, and the institutions can do a lot to prevent the institutional ableism. And sometimes I feel like if museums like published an etiquette guide for other visitors, it would be kind of awkward. But I feel like if anyone who walked into a museum just learned these things like basic etiquette, it would help so much, because it would take a lot of it would take all the responsibility off the people who are actually disabled. But a lot of things have happened. There was another museum in Frankfurt. Frankfurt has a lot of museums for a town of their size. There was another museum that was focused. They had an exhibition focused on blindness. And it was supposed to give visitors the blind experience, which in itself is both educational, but when depending on how it's done, had the potential to be problematic. I don't know, because they didn't let me in. So I was really, really excited to go to that exhibition. I knew some people who had gone. They said it was great. And so I am an ambulatory wheelchair user, so sometimes I can go to a museum and walk or use my crutch, but this particular time, I just had a surgery, and I was going to be in my chair the whole time. So I called them up and I asked them. I said, "Oh, well, how does this work?" Because the whole exhibition is in the dark. So I said, "Are there going to be stairs? How can I do this?" And I looked on their website recently, and they've actually since changed it. They now allow wheelchair users, but they told me that that it wasn't possible and I couldn't come. I either had to walk or I couldn't go to their exhibition at all. So that's kind of a combination of institutional and casual ableism. So it happens.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's the worst example I've ever had, like not even being allowed in the door. But definitely, yeah.
From my point of view, working with the museum sector for something like 20 years now, I know that a lot of attention and a lot of work has been, and a lot of investment has been dedicated to make improvements. So it is particularly distressing when, of course, it is not universal, and it is particularly distressing to see that our museums are not as inclusive as we would like them to be, and that's why your contribution is particularly significant, and I hope it will make a difference. On this point, we have a question about the universal design, and if you have any examples from Emily is asking if you have any examples of universal design in private settings, housing, for example, or other places where universal design really made a difference.
Yes, it doesn't have to be a public building, and with private buildings, they have a lot more leeway to either do that or not do that, because with private buildings, they don't have the same legal demands to make it as accessible. So yeah, I mean, even though if it's a building that is open to the public, it's not going to be under the same scrutiny as a public institution like a museum. But yeah, I showed the V&A because that was my favorite example of universal design, where they integrate the sleek aesthetic with the practical accessibility of it. But basically, the simplest form of universal design is just having a flat entrance and having a lift. There are other examples of museums that have that. The Norton Simon Museum has that in Pasadena, California, and so does SF MoMA in California as well. So for private buildings, if they want to have universal design, they don't have to spend lots and lots of money creating this sleek integration of stairs and a ramp. They can just have a flat entrance. That would be my suggestion.
There is a question by Johannes about the cost and the budget for these things, and of course he says he has a quite long question, but since we are talking about money, I think I will first read the financial part. How to handle economical constraints, how much of the budget can or should be spent on making the museum universal? What about very specialized museums without any budget?
Yes, it's really interesting. So it depends on if it's a public museum or a private museum. Because if it's a public museum, and especially if it's accepting any public funding, then it really does need to spend whatever is necessary for the budget, necessary for the accessibility, sorry. And yeah, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to, you don't have to tear every single thing down to do it. Sometimes it can just be putting in a lift or redoing the stairs. So with the example that the V&A, they redid it in 2001, which is 20 years ago. And that was long after the ADA was passed, but the Equality Act in the UK wasn't passed until 2010. So that was actually quite a bit before its time. So it doesn't have to be, you can work within budget constraints, but I would say visit the mission statement of the museum or whatever the organization is. And if they're saying that they want to provide something to everybody and they can't, then they're not really finishing their mission statement. They're not complying with it. They're not living it.
Exactly, but I think museums, especially in the UK, do build in this design into their budgeting quite regularly, especially the bigger museums. I mean, I think Johannes has a point about the smaller places, more private institutions, more which might be struggling with finding the budget for this. But
and it doesn't have to be huge.
Exactly, it doesn't have to be huge, and some of the historic buildings that house collections in museums are quite problematic anyhow in terms of their preservation and their design. I will leave the budgeting aside and move into curatorial practices, and this stems from Johannes' question about how to make curatorial practices more inclusive, more universal. And also there is a question by Gemma about how the museums can contact disabled communities to contribute to exhibition design.
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Yes, how how museums, do you have any suggestions on how museums can contact disabled communities to contribute to exhibition design, curatorial programs, and
Definitely.
things like that? Are you aware of any examples where this happened?
I know that the Boston Museum of Science is very good about that, and they were one of the earlier museums to be implementing that. This is why having a disability advisory council is really good, and part of making sure you cover your bases with that is making sure you have a wide range of disability types, so you don't leave any type of disability out. But really, disabled visitors, just like all other types of visitors, there's a very big group of disabled people who like going to the museums. So if a museum doesn't have an advisory council, and if they even just put out a notice asking that they were interested in talking to disabled visitors about that kind of thing, I'm sure there'd be a swarm of participants who would want to contribute their opinions. And I remember you said that Johannes asked something about how to make curatorial design more inclusive. So a lot of that, the thing about making curatorial design inclusive is that it's not really included in this disability legislation. So it's not as scrutinized as architecture is. So in some ways, curators have to think out of the box a little bit more, but sometimes the upside to that is that it's not like architecture. The solutions are not expensive at all. I mean, in most cases, they're free. So an example that I was thinking of is yet another museum in Frankfurt, because there are a lot of them, like on this one street. There was another museum, and there was an exhibition that I went to there a few years ago in my chair. And the exhibition started on the ground floor and it continued on the first floor, but the lift was in a different part of the building than where the staircase was. And so the exhibition told this very specific narrative that you had to follow physically, because it had a timeline, but also commentaries, and it was just this multifaceted exhibition narrative. And so I went to the lift on the other side of the exhibition, and I came up and I arrived on the first story, and I had no idea where I was. And a simple thing that a curator can do is just have a sign at the top and say, this is where the exhibition continues. So making curatorial things more inclusive can just be like adding more descriptions, adding directions, not using ableist language like some of the terms. It's a lot more flexible. Like the upsides are that it's free, and there's a lot more room to do it.
I think this your last experience is very similar to one Melanie is describing in the comment box, where she had a terrible experience a few years ago at the Smithsonian, visiting the Freer Sackler galleries, and these galleries were recently renovated, and despite the renovation, she had an ordeal of moving around and finding the entrance and the exit, etc. So I would say that one thing you can certainly make sure is to leave your feedback for the museum, or to write to them personally, directly, because someone at the museum will look at visitor feedback, and they will pay attention to these comments. A very little thing you can do. I know it might you might not feel like doing it after a terrible visit, but museums do pay attention to visitor feedback, and this is something you can use to push things forward. Elizabeth is asking for further recommendations on this topic. Is there any literature you could recommend? Or if anyone is interested from the audience, can they contact you directly, or
yes,
how would you like to deal with this?
I will put my email in there. I'll put my email in there in a second, but yeah, so that's a very good question. There's less, there is literature out there on disability in museums. So most of the research that I did for this, some of it was listening to videos of curators and museum professionals, but actually the reason why I spent so much time on disability theory was that if you understand disability theory, you can apply it to almost any profession or circle. So I would say if this is a new field to you, I would definitely recommend learning more about basic disability theory and the history of the disability rights movement in California, starting from the 70s, because it's kind of like an essential foundation for understanding how ableism and the social model work in any public space. So yeah, there definitely are some books out there, but they're quite limited compared to the wealth of information on disability theory. So I would, but please, I'll add my email, and please do feel free to contact me. That would be great.
Excellent. I am Barty. How are we doing for time?
Thank you. Maybe one more question, and then we will have to go to Greg to do the vote of thanks.
Excellent. Then, Ashley, can you tell us a little bit more about what is next in your plans then? And how are you planning to continue your work on this subject and to promote inclusivity and with museums, etc.? Do you have
Absolutely.
something coming?
Well, I mean, it's a topic that's very important to me. So I actually I knew that these were issues that bothered me a lot, but I went to high school in Oakland on the border of Berkeley, which is where the disability rights movement started. But my school never taught me anything about the ADA. I didn't learn the word ableism until I got to college. So I really felt like quite a latecomer for someone who actually was disabled to find out that disabled students actually do have rights and we're a community. So once I did start getting more involved in the activist circles at university, I realized that it was something I wanted to be doing more of. So I'm doing my second master's right now, and I got interested in doing this topic specifically in museums in a class that I took this past term called Curating Cultures. So I'm thinking about at least, I'm not sure what the steps would be much later, but right now I'm planning on potentially writing my dissertation on this. So I'd like to do some more research on this, especially in curatorial writing, because there is a lot more research done on universal design and how to get people into the museums, but it's the content of the exhibitions that actually matter a lot as well and are quite under-researched at the moment.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Great. Barty.
So now I will introduce you all to Greg Bowie, who is our wonderful president of American Friends of SOAS, and he will present the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Barty. Hi, everybody. Yes, it's my pleasure to thank both of you on behalf of our entire American Friends of SOAS Board of Directors and the alumni community here in the US that we serve. I want to extend our sincerest thanks to each of you. Ashley, for your insightful presentation, and Dr. Kostoglu for serving as our moderator today. And also, I always have to thank Barty, Dr. Barty Kansara, who is our AFSOAS Vice President, for organizing today's event, as always. If you enjoyed today's discussion, we appeal to all of you to make a contribution in support of the incredible academics offered at SOAS. Alternatively, as the Association of SOAS alumni here in the US, AFSOAS offers one scholarship annually to an American student in financial need to study a full-time one-year top master's program at SOAS in London. To date, we have had 7 recipients of the John Loyello AFSOAS scholarship, and we would so appreciate your support of this initiative so we can continue to make this opportunity available to deserving students. I put a link right now in the chat box where you can go to make a tax-deductible contribution on our website. And again, there's no amount too small, so whatever you can give would be very much appreciated. And of course, I want to thank all of you for making the time to be with us today to discuss such an important topic, for your interest in this topic, and for being a part of the American Friends of SOAS virtual event series. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate you being with us. And again, Ashley and Dr. Kostoglu, thank you so much. So
Thank you, Greg.
everyone, have a great day.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
good luck with all your efforts to get promotion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.